Hello, and welcome to the Drowsy Historian. Tonight, we'll journey back in time to a world that's slower, simpler, and in many ways, harsher. A world where life inside an 1800s American asylum was quiet, repetitive, and filled with uncertainty. The days were long, and the nights even longer. But this journey is not about hardship or fear. It's about the ordinary moments, the slow passage of time that made up the lives of those who lived there. In this story, we'll walk through cold, brick hallways, hear the distant echoes of footsteps, and breathe in the still air of a place where every day felt the same, but was somehow never quite the same. It was a time when people were afraid. They didn't understand the minds of others, when the world was slower and the world was harsher. So sit back, relax, and let your mind wander as we begin this gentle journey into history. A history that's quiet and soft just for you. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slow, soft-spoken stories designed to help you unwind and drift off to sleep, consider subscribing to the Drowsy Historian. New sleepy journeys every week just for you. And now, let's begin our tale of a life inside an 1800s American asylum. In the 1800s, the world was a very different place. The concept of mental health and the treatment of those deemed mentally ill was not as we understand it today. In fact, it was a time when the mind was still very much a mystery, and the people who struggled with it were often misunderstood and feared. People were afraid. They didn't understand. The world was slower. The world was harsher. The minds of men and women were not yet explored with the precision of modern science. And so, any behavior that deviated from what was considered normal was often labeled as madness, a curse, or even a punishment from the heavens. Back then, the very idea of mental illness was tangled in a complex web of beliefs, and often these beliefs came from a mix of superstition, religion, and limited medical knowledge. Doctors believed that an imbalance in the humors, the body's vital fluids, could cause madness. They saw the mind as something tied to the body's physical state, but also something that could be influenced by the environment, the soul, and the spirit. This was a time when diseases of the mind were linked to ideas of moral decay, and any lapse in behavior could be seen as a personal failure rather than a health condition. People who suffered from mental illnesses were often seen as different, something to be feared, and, in many cases, isolated. Families, unable to care for their loved ones, were often left with few options. There was no understanding, no medical support that could offer relief or healing. Instead, families would sometimes hide their relatives away in their homes, or, when the situation became too much, they might send them away to one of the growing number of asylums. The fear of insanity ran deep in society. If you showed signs of mental instability, you were often removed from society entirely, kept in a place where silence and routine were meant to tame your mind, and where, in many cases, your family would forget about you. Back then, people didn't know how to heal the mind. They didn't know how to restore balance to the spirit. And so, people were locked away as the world turned slower and colder. And as the 19th century unfolded, there was an explosion in the construction of asylums across America. The number of these institutions grew rapidly, and with them grew the belief that a new type of care, a new approach, could be found for those who were mentally ill. But these asylums, they were not places of understanding or healing as we would imagine today. No, these were cold, stark buildings, designed not for recovery, but for containment. They were created in response to the increasing number of people with mental illnesses, but the systems that housed them were often poorly designed, and just as isolating as the fears that had put them there. They were built with the assumption that order, routine, and strictness were the only answers. And yet, those inside these institutions, whether they were patients or staff, were left to navigate the maze of silence, separation, and harsh treatment. They didn't understand. The world was slower and more distant. People were afraid of madness, of the unknown. And so, They turned to these asylums to keep their loved ones safe and to protect themselves. People were afraid. They didn't understand. The world was slower. The world was harsher. As we stepped inside the asylum of the 1800s, imagine the cold, the stillness, the isolation that greeted you the moment you crossed its threshold. The first thing you would notice is the building itself, large and looming, constructed from dark red brick, stretching toward the sky like a fortress. A place built not to invite warmth or comfort, but to impose discipline, order, and containment. These buildings were towering structures, often with multiple floors, each layer designed to house as many patients as possible. Their windows, though large, were often covered with iron bars, a visible sign of the fortress-like nature of these institutions. The bars weren't just there for the protection of the outside world, but for the protection of the people inside. The staff believed that they could control the unpredictable, the dangerous, by enclosing it within these walls. The walls themselves were cold to the touch, always damp, and perpetually chilled by the passing seasons. The air inside the building was often still, unmoving, trapped between the stone walls and the wooden beams. You could almost feel the weight of the silence that pressed down on you, as though the building itself had been designed not just for containment, but for suffocating the very will to speak, to act, to exist beyond mere survival. The long hallways, stretching like endless corridors, seemed to go on forever. They were narrow and dimly lit, even in the daytime. Faint rays of sunlight would creep through the high windows, but they struggled to reach the cold stone floors below. The floors themselves were hard, unforgiving, made of old, worn wood that creaked with every step. The steps of patients, nurses, and doctors echoed through the silence, a constant reminder that the building was never truly quiet. Each floor had several rooms, small, cramped, designed to house individuals who had little hope of ever leaving. These rooms were bare with only the most basic furnishings. A small, iron bed with a thin mattress of straw or wool, often uncomfortable and prone to sagging, a single woolen blanket, scratchy and rough to the touch, and a small wooden chair. The walls of these rooms were bare, except for a single window with those thick metal bars, and a small wooden table where the patient might be given their meals. The smell of the asylum was pervasive. The musty scent of old wood mixed with the distinct odor of damp stone was always in the air. It wasn't a smell that ever seemed to leave. There was a constant feeling of dampness that would seep into the bones, even on the driest of days. If you stood in the hallway for long enough, the smell would begin to cling to you, a scent that you couldn't escape, no matter how many times you washed your hands or changed your clothes. The air inside the asylum was heavy, stagnant, and stale. You could almost taste it on your tongue, a reminder that the outside world, with its fresh air and freedom, was a long way off. Sometimes, if the doors to the courtyard were opened, you might catch a brief whiff of fresh air, but it would quickly disappear as the doors shut once more, returning you to that heavy, suffocating atmosphere. And the sounds of the asylum, they too were unsettling. There was the ever-present hum of silence, but beneath that silence, you could hear the soft echo of distant footsteps, the shuffle of nurses in the hallways, the footsteps of the patients who were allowed to walk freely, the occasional creak of the heavy wooden doors opening and closing. The sounds of the asylum were not loud or jarring, but they were constant, a reminder that you were never alone, not truly. In some parts of the asylum, you could hear the distant clanging of metal. The doors to the rooms would sometimes be locked with heavy iron chains or bolts, and the sound of these locks being undone would echo down the hallways, causing a ripple of anxiety to pass through those who heard it. For some patients, the sound of metal meant they were about to be confined again, maybe for days, maybe for weeks, in a dark room where the only thing they could do was wait. As you walked through the halls, you might pass by the observation rooms, glass-walled chambers where doctors would sit watching the patients, documenting their every movement, their every action, as if studying them, but never truly seeing them as people. These rooms, with their large windows, allowed the doctors to look into the private moments of their patients' lives, to observe their behaviors, without ever having to interact with them. The glass was meant to keep the doctors safe, to separate them from the madness they believed they were studying. to maintain their sense of control. And beyond these observation rooms, there were courtyards, but not the kind of courtyards you might imagine. These were stark, empty spaces, surrounded by high walls with little to no greenery, except for a few trees that looked withered and bare, their branches reaching up like skeletal arms. The air in the courtyards was still, and in the winter, the ground would often be covered with a layer of frost, or even snow. During the warmer months, the trees would cast long, shadowy stretches across the concrete ground, but the spaces never seemed to feel inviting. There was no sense of freedom in the air, only the feeling of being trapped in a small, enclosed world. In the distance, you might occasionally hear the sound of a bird, a distant song from somewhere beyond the walls of the asylum. But even the bird's song felt far away, unreachable, much like everything else that existed outside of the asylum's walls. You could never quite touch it, never quite grasp it. The world outside seemed so distant, so foreign, compared to the world inside these cold brick walls. The rooms were not only dark, they were often cold, and the air inside was thick with dampness. If you were fortunate enough to have a fire in your room, the warmth would not last long. The cold always seemed to return, creeping in through the cracks in the walls, and the icy chill would remain, even through the thickest of blankets. The hallways were long, stretching endlessly from one side of the building to the other, and each turn you made would reveal more of the same. The long, uninviting stretches of cold stone, the flickering gas lamps on the walls, the same faces, the same staff. The world inside the asylum was one of repetition, a daily cycle that never seemed to end. Every day felt the same coldness, the same silence, the same longing for something, anything, that might break the monotony. Inside the asylum, life moved at a slow, mechanical pace. Each day began with the shrill sound of a bell, piercing the silence of the early morning, calling everyone to rise. The bell wasn't gentle, it wasn't soft. It was loud, insistent, designed to startle you out of sleep. It didn't matter if you were still dreaming. If your body craved rest, the bell rang, and you had no choice but to rise. People were afraid. They didn't understand. The world was slower, the world was harsher, and the days that followed were filled with routine repetition. A sense that time moved, but nothing ever changed. The first task of the day was always the same. The patients, weary from the night's restless sleep, would slowly drag themselves from their beds. The beds themselves were made of cold iron, their thin mattresses barely offering any comfort. Many patients had trouble sleeping, their minds racing with memories, thoughts, or even the blank emptiness that often filled their heads. But the bell didn't care about their sleep, and neither did the day ahead. Rising, dressing, and moving, that was the beginning of each new day. The nurses, often dressed in simple uniforms, would enter the rooms, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floors. They would walk slowly, methodically, checking each patient, making sure they were up and dressed, making sure they followed the strict routine. There was little interaction between the patients and the staff. The nurses had their jobs to do, and the patients had their roles to play, but those roles were never the same as the ones they had in the world outside the asylum. After waking up, the patients were ushered into the common areas, sometimes a large room, often cold and barren, with rows of benches and tables where the patients would sit for their meals. The smell of the food wasn't inviting. It was simple, plain, tasteless. A thin, watery porridge was usually the first meal of the day, sometimes served with hard bread that was difficult to chew. The tea, too, was weak and insipid. There was no warmth to the food, no comfort. It was the kind of meal that didn't nourish the soul, only the body. Eating wasn't something to look forward to. It was a necessity, a routine that everyone went through. The patients ate in silence, often not speaking to one another. Some didn't have the strength to speak, others didn't have the desire. The room was quiet, the clinking of spoons against bowls, the sound of feet shuffling across the floor. There was no joy in the air, only the heavy weight of repetition. Every day, the same. After breakfast, there was a brief window of time for individual tasks. But the activities were simple, menial. Some patients were tasked with cleaning the hallways, sweeping dust from the wooden floors with rough brooms. Others would tend to the small garden outside, pulling weeds from the dry, cracked soil. A few were taught basic skills like knitting or sewing, though it wasn't always clear what these tasks were meant to achieve. There was no sense of personal accomplishment, no sense of achievement. The work was mundane, and, like everything else in the asylum, it felt never-ending. The gardens were small, walled off from the rest of the world. There was no lush greenery or vibrant flowers. Instead, there were just a few dry bushes, trees that barely grew, their branches twisted and sparse. The air in the garden wasn't fresh. It was still stagnant, much like the life inside the asylum. Every step taken in that courtyard felt like a slow march through time, a reminder that the outside world was far away. The patients, though allowed a brief moment outside, were still under close supervision. There was always someone watching. The staff kept their distance, but their eyes never left the patients. Every move was noted, every action observed. You could almost feel the weight of the eyes on you, even if you didn't see them. There was a constant feeling of being watched, of being judged. The courtyard, though open to the sky, was still a cage, a place to pass time, but never to escape from it. And when the work was done, when the time spent in the garden or the halls was over, there was nothing left to do but wait. The days were long, and the patients had little to look forward to. The waiting seemed endless, each minute stretching into the next. It was a time of emptiness, a time to reflect, or perhaps to forget. But even in that quiet waiting, there was no relief, just the same oppressive silence. In the evening, after another simple meal, the patients were often left to themselves once more. There was no entertainment, no distractions. In some cases, a few might gather in small groups to talk quietly, but even then, the conversations were muted. No one raised their voice. No one spoke with any real enthusiasm. It was as if the asylum, with its cold walls and dull routines, had taken the energy from their souls. They sat, and they waited for nothing to change. The night was the hardest part of the day. Once the bell rang again, signaling the end of the day's activities, the patients were returned to their rooms. The lights would be dimmed, and the doors would be locked. The patients, alone in their rooms, were left with nothing but their thoughts, their fears, and the heavy weight of the silence that filled the air. Many couldn't sleep, not because they weren't tired, but because their minds wouldn't let them rest. The hours stretched on. The sounds of the building became sharper in the dark. The distant creak of a door, the faint shuffle of footsteps down the hallway. The cold air seeped in through the cracks in the walls, chilling the room even further. The bed, though covered in thick blankets, offered little comfort. The weight of the day hung over them, the weight of each moment, each breath. The walls felt closer, the air thinner, the night longer. Every day, the same faces, the same walls, the same silence. The moments bled together. No hope for a tomorrow that would be any different. The patients waited for sleep to come, to take them away from the monotony, to give them a brief reprieve from the endless cycle that consumed them. But for many, sleep never came easily. The hours were filled with restless tossing, anxious thoughts, and the quiet sounds of the asylum echoing in the distance. And as they lay there in the dark, the only thing they could do was wait for another day to begin, just like the one before. The treatments in the 1800s asylum were rudimentary at best, cruel at worst. For those inside, the idea of healing was a distant dream. The medical practices of the time were based on theories that now seem harsh, misguided, and ineffective. But in the 1800s, this was the world they knew. They believed that the mind could be healed, but they didn't truly understand how to treat it. They believed this would help. They hoped. They didn't know better. One of the most common treatments for patients was bloodletting, or sangria as it was called. Doctors thought that the imbalance of the humors blood, bile, and phlegm was what caused mental instability. By drawing blood from a patient, they hoped to restore balance, to relieve the madness they believed was caused by an overabundance of blood. The practice was ancient, dating back to Hippocratic medicine, but it persisted well into the 19th century. For patients, the experience was painful, frightening, and often ineffective. They would be strapped to a chair or a table, their veins opened with a sharp instrument, and blood would be drained from their bodies. The treatment left them weak, lightheaded, exhausted, but still mentally unwell. The belief was that by losing blood, the body would be purged of the evil humors. But for most patients, this only added to their suffering. Bloodletting, along with other invasive procedures, was meant to force the body into balance, to correct whatever was thought to be wrong. However, these treatments often left patients in worse condition, drained of their vitality and left to recover in a weakened state, if they were fortunate enough to recover at all. And then there were the cold baths, another treatment that was often prescribed for mental illness. Doctors believed that cold water could shock the body into balance, that it could shock the mind back to sanity. Patients would be submerged in icy water, sometimes for long periods, their bodies trembling from the chill. The cold bath was a harsh and painful experience, meant to shock the system into submission. It was believed that by inducing extreme discomfort, the body and mind would be forced into a state of healing. But for many, the cold baths were nothing more than an experience of intense suffering. The shock to the system often left patients in a heightened state of agitation, or even worse, with no change to their condition. These cold treatments weren't limited to just baths. Sometimes patients were subjected to cold douches or sprays, aimed at the same goal of shocking the mind and body into compliance. The chilling water would be sprayed over them in the belief that it could somehow cleanse them of their madness. But in reality, it served only to further distress and confuse the patients. The use of opium and various narcotics was also widespread during this time. These substances, thought to have calming properties, were frequently used to sedate patients, to dull their senses and make them more manageable. Opium was often prescribed in the form of laudanum, a tincture that contained alcohol and opium. It was used to calm agitated patients, to ease their suffering, but it did so by numbing their minds, dulling their emotions, making them more passive and less aware of the reality around them. For some patients, it might offer brief moments of respite, but for others, it only deepened their sense of numbness and isolation. The opioid tinctures and other drugs were seen as a way to treat the madness, but they didn't offer true healing. They merely served to mask the symptoms, to cover up the pain and confusion, but never to alleviate the root cause. Some patients became addicted to these substances, relying on them to dull the endless agony of their condition. The narcotics, while offering temporary relief, only led to further despair. Confinement was another treatment method that was widely used. In many asylums, patients were locked away in dark, windowless rooms. These rooms were designed to be secure, to prevent patients from escaping or causing harm to themselves or others. But the reality of confinement was much more grim. The isolation of being locked away in a dark room for days, weeks, or even months was meant to provide a kind of calm for the patients, away from the stimuli that might cause their madness to worsen. But in truth, confinement often made patients more agitated, more paranoid, and more fearful. The silence of the room, the absence of human contact, turned the mind inward, leading to greater distress. There were even rooms specifically designed for those patients who were considered especially dangerous or uncontrollable. These rooms were often small, windowless, and dark, where the patients were left alone with nothing but their thoughts. Sometimes they were restrained, tied down to prevent them from moving, pacing, or hurting themselves. The use of restraints, such as the straitjacket, was common during this time. The straitjacket was designed to keep patients from thrashing about, from injuring themselves or others, but it also served to dehumanize the patients, stripping them of their autonomy, their dignity, and their ability to express themselves. The tightness of the jacket cut off movement, forcing the patient into a stillness that only added to the feelings of helplessness. There was no understanding of mental health the way we understand it today. The treatments were not based on a desire to heal, but rather on a belief that control, subjugation, and order could fix what was broken. The patients were seen as problems to be solved, but no one truly understood how to solve them. And while some doctors and staff believed they were helping, Others felt the weight of their own helplessness. They, too, were trapped in a system that didn't offer answers, that didn't provide true relief. They did what they could, what they were taught. But the methods were often ineffective and at times cruel. The treatments were not kind, not gentle, but they were the only options available at the time. And for the patients, there was no escape. They were trapped in a cycle of pain, and the only thing they could do was wait for the treatments to stop, for something, anything to change. They believed this would help. They hoped. They didn't know better. And in that uncertainty, in that ignorance, the patients suffered. They were caught in a world of experimentation, a world that didn't understand them, a world that was harsh and unforgiving. Inside the asylum, there was a clear divide between the patients and the staff. Both lived in their own worlds, rarely intersecting beyond the most basic interactions. The patients were treated as cases, as problems to be managed, and the staff, though compassionate at times, were often constrained by the system they worked within. The lives of the patients were dictated by routine, isolation, and treatments, while the lives of the staff revolved around the tasks assigned to them by the institution. The patients inside the asylum were varied, each one unique in their struggles, yet bound by the same fate. Some had come to the asylum because of tragedies that had broken their minds. Others were there for reasons that were not well understood. But what all these patients shared was a sense of helplessness, a feeling of being trapped in a place where time moved too slowly and where nothing ever seemed to change. Many of the patients were women whose minds had been broken by the pressures of society, by the expectations placed on them by their families, their husbands, or society at large. Depression, anxiety, and melancholia were common diagnoses for women in the 1800s. These women were often sent to asylums by their families, deemed to be mentally ill for exhibiting behavior that was seen as unusual or too emotional. Some were mothers who had suffered from postpartum depression, their minds shattered by the overwhelming demands of childbirth and motherhood. Others were young women who had been driven mad by the pressure of a society that told them they must be perfect, that their worth was tied to their appearance, their behavior, and their ability to conform. The men in the asylum had their own stories. Some had been driven mad by war, soldiers who had returned from battle, scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. These men were often diagnosed with shell shock, a term used during World War I to describe what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But in the 1800s, there was no understanding of trauma in the way we know it today. The men who had seen the atrocities of war were often placed in asylums, their minds broken by the things they had done or seen. They, too, were subjected to the same treatments and routines as the women. They were often isolated, left to grapple with their trauma in silence. There were also the younger patients, children or adolescents whose behavior was deemed unacceptable by society's standards. Some had seizures, which were misunderstood as signs of madness. Others were simply too energetic, too rebellious, or too different for the rigid structures of the time. These young people were often sent to asylums by their parents, who saw them as unmanageable or too difficult to handle. The children, who might have simply been suffering from a mental illness or developmental disorder, were placed in the same cold, oppressive environment as the adults, where they, too, were subjected to the same harsh treatments and isolation. And then there were the elderly, those who had entered the asylum because of age-related conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's. These elderly patients were often the most vulnerable. Their minds, once sharp and full of memories, were slowly fading, leaving them confused and frightened. They, too, were often forgotten by their families, left to spend their final days in the asylum, their memories slipping away in the dimly lit rooms. These patients were rarely understood, and their suffering, in many ways, went unnoticed. The staff, on the other hand, were the ones responsible for maintaining the routines of the asylum. They were tasked with ensuring that the patients followed the daily schedule, that they ate their meals, took their medicine, and completed their assigned tasks. But the staff were not always equipped to deal with the complexity of the patient's needs. Many of the nurses and attendants were young women, often with little formal medical training. They were expected to be caretakers, but they were also expected to keep control of the asylum, The nurses had to balance the demands of the patients with the orders of the doctors and the institution's rules. Their interactions with the patients were often limited to the bare minimum, ensuring they were fed, bathed, and given their medications. There were also the doctors, the physicians who were responsible for diagnosing and treating the patients. The doctors, like the nurses, were often bound by the limitations of the time. They had little understanding of mental illness, and their treatments were often based on outdated theories or unproven methods. The doctors would make rounds, writing in their journals, observing the patients, and making notes about their condition. But these notes were rarely more than observations of behavior. The doctors rarely engaged with the patients on a personal level, seeing them more as cases to be managed than people to be understood. The supervisors and attendants, the higher-ranking staff, were often distant from the patients. They would walk through the halls, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floors, their eyes scanning the rooms to ensure that the patients were in line. The supervisors were not concerned with the well-being of the patients on a personal level. Their job was to maintain order and ensure that the asylum ran smoothly. They would occasionally intervene in the daily routines if there was an issue, but otherwise, their presence was mostly a reminder of the rigid hierarchy that governed life inside the asylum. There were rare moments of kindness. Some of the nurses, especially those who had worked at the asylum for years, had developed a certain rapport with the patients. They knew the names of the regulars, the ones who had been there for years, and they might exchange a kind word or a brief smile. But for the most part, the staff and patients lived in separate worlds. There was a distance between them that was impossible to bridge. The patients were often seen as nothing more than their diagnoses, their conditions. And the staff, though they might have sympathized with their plight, were trapped in a system that demanded they remain detached. The relationships between the staff and patients were often formal, distant, even cold. The nurses, though tasked with caring for the patients, could never afford to get too close. To show affection, to show kindness beyond the necessary, was dangerous. It blurred the lines between the caretaker and the cared for. And in an institution like this, where control was paramount, such boundaries could not be crossed. There were occasional moments of tenderness, when a nurse would offer a soft word to a distressed patient, when a doctor might take a moment to reassure someone. But these moments were fleeting, they were rare, and they were overshadowed by the harsh realities of the asylum structure. The patients, in turn, found their own ways of coping with their isolation. Some formed small bonds with fellow patients, their silent camaraderie providing comfort in the face of their shared suffering. Others retreated further into themselves, lost in the quiet corners of the asylum. The patients who had been there the longest were often the ones who seemed most resigned to their fate. They had been broken by the system, and they knew that nothing would change for them. Every day, the same faces, the same walls, the same silence. But through it all, they held on to the faint hope that, somehow, things might improve, even if they knew deep down that, in this place, hope was a rare and fragile thing. As the day drew to a close and the last echo of footsteps faded down the long, cold hallways of the asylum, the once bustling institution fell into a deep, almost suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that didn't soothe the soul, but rather pressed in on the mind, making the walls feel closer, as if the very space around you were shrinking, narrowing the room in which you existed. The air, which had been heavy with the mundane activity of the day, now hung still, stagnant. There was no longer the sound of nurses moving briskly down the hallways, or the murmurs of the patients drifting in and out of their small, solitary worlds. Now, only the occasional creak of the wooden floors beneath the weight of someone's feet would punctuate the otherwise oppressive silence. And then, the muffled sound of a door, thick and wooden, locking behind a nurse or a supervisor, followed by the heavy clank of metal bolts securing the halls. The sound of locks being turned, doors being bolted shut, would echo through the asylum, its finality adding to the sense of isolation that overtook the patients as darkness fell. It was not merely the physical confinement, but the psychological weight of knowing that, for the night, you were alone with nothing but your thoughts and the deep silence that wrapped itself around you like a blanket. And, as night settled in, the patients found themselves confined to their rooms. Their doors were locked from the outside, and the sound of the thick iron keys turning would reverberate in the minds of those who listened carefully. It was a familiar sound, a signal that all contact with the outside world had ceased, a reminder that they were not free, not even for a moment. The harsh reality of their situation felt more pronounced as the walls closed in, and the rooms became smaller, colder. For many patients, sleep was not a welcome escape, but a long, drawn-out struggle. The cold, hard bed beneath them provided little comfort, and the thin woolen blankets, which barely offered warmth, seemed to mock their attempts to find rest. The chill of the night, seeping in through the cracks in the walls, would gnaw at them until they finally managed to drift into an uneasy slumber, only to be woken by a sudden sound, a distant echo, the rattling of chains or the faintest murmur of someone's voice in another room. The night, though cold and silent, was not peaceful. It was filled with the quiet sounds that could only be heard in the dark, sounds that seemed louder because of the silence around them. The shuffle of a nurse's shoes down the hall, the distant sound of a patient crying out, the quiet groaning of the asylum's old wooden structure as it settled into the night. The silence was never complete. In the dead of night, it was punctuated by the faintest sounds of movement, the hushed whispers of patients talking in the dark, too soft for anyone to hear, but loud enough to comfort each other. The creaking of the floorboards as a nurse walked from one room to another, making her rounds. Sometimes, it was the soft sobs of those who had never fully accepted their fate. For some, sleep was not something that came easily. Restless minds would often toss and turn, unable to escape the unrelenting thoughts that ran like a storm inside their heads. Outside the windows, the night was unyielding. The moon hung high in the sky, casting cold light through the thick metal bars, its pale glow adding to the eerie atmosphere of the asylum. The trees outside, their branches twisted and bare, swayed in the wind, their long shadows stretching across the cracked stone courtyard like dark fingers reaching for something that could never be grasped. The courtyard was deserted at night, a barren patch of earth, where nothing ever seemed to grow, and nothing ever seemed to change. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the occasional flutter of leaves or the whisper of distant birds. But these sounds felt far away, as if they came from another world, a world outside the confines of the asylum. The wind, though loud, never seemed to offer any relief. It simply served as a reminder of what was beyond the walls, beyond the iron bars. The patients, however, were left alone with their thoughts, confined in the stillness of the asylum. In the halls, the only sounds were the soft echoes of the building settling, the occasional distant footsteps of a staff member making their rounds, checking on patients or ensuring that doors were locked. But these sounds didn't belong to the patients. They belonged to the staff, who came and went, as if they were ghosts passing through the night. For the patients, the night was the hardest time. There were no distractions, no activities to pass the time. There was nothing but the slow, steady tick of the clock on the wall marking time, and a long, drawn-out silence that seemed to deepen as the night wore on. It was a time for reflection, for regret, for the mind to wander through the memories of the day and the past. It was a time to face the harsh reality of their confinement, to realize that there was nothing beyond the walls, nothing but the slow, suffocating passage of time. Many patients would try to sleep, their minds exhausted from the weight of the day, but sleep would not come. The darkness of the room seemed to press down on them, thick and suffocating. The chill in the air felt like a constant presence, creeping beneath the blanket, gnawing at the skin. The beds were small, uncomfortable, and there was no escape from them. The hardwood beneath them felt unyielding, the metal bed frame cold against their limbs. They would shift in bed, trying to find some measure of comfort, but it was futile. Sleep would come only in fits and starts, if it came at all. The faint sound of another patient's voice might rise in the darkness, a soft murmur, a low cry, but no one would answer. There was no comfort to be found in the night. It was a time of solitude, of isolation. Even in the dark, even in the quiet, they were alone. The night was long, slow, and cold, and for the patients, it was the worst part of the day. Every night felt like an eternity, a never-ending stretch of time that seemed to hang over them like a cloud, waiting to crush them beneath its weight. The only reprieve came in the form of brief moments, when the wind outside would blow harder, or the sound of distant footsteps would break the silence. These brief moments would stir something deep within, but they were fleeting, vanishing as quickly as they had come. And soon, it would be back to the silence, back to the waiting, back to the long, dark night that felt as if it would never end. The night, in all its stillness, its quiet despair, was the hardest part of the asylum's existence. It was when the mind was most exposed, when the fear of madness seemed closest, when the quiet weight of isolation pressed down most heavily. And so the night stretched on slow and heavy, with only the faintest sounds to remind them that they were still alive, still breathing, still waiting for the dawn that would bring another day in the asylum. In the midst of the endless silence, the cold, and the monotony of life inside the asylum, there were small moments, fleeting, fragile moments of relief. They didn't come often, and when they did, they were never long-lasting. But for the patients, those rare moments were the only glimpses of warmth, of hope, in a world that otherwise felt harsh and unyielding. The days were long, and often, it felt as though they would stretch on forever. But in these rare instances, time would seem to slow, just for a brief moment, offering the promise of comfort, of something beyond the walls, beyond the routines, and beyond the isolation. It was as though the world, for just a moment, acknowledged their humanity, their existence, and their longing for something more than the cold, unfeeling institution that surrounded them. And one of the smallest, yet most profound moments of relief came when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the high, iron-barred windows of the asylum. The morning light, though pale and distant, offered a small reprieve from the cold, dark nights. As the dawn approached, there would be a faint shifting in the atmosphere, as if the world outside the asylum were waking up and stirring. The light would begin to creep in slowly, like a soft whisper in the dark. It would fall across the stone floors and bare walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift, like a brief dance of light and dark. For a brief moment, the room would warm, just enough to offer a sense of comfort, a sense that the world outside was not as cold as the space they were confined to. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind them that time was passing, that life, outside these walls, was continuing. The sunlight didn't stay long, of course. It was fleeting, just like all the moments of comfort in the asylum. The heavy, iron bars outside the windows would block the warmth of the sun from reaching them fully. The light would only touch the room for a short while before retreating, leaving the patients once again in the shadow of their confinement. But that brief moment, as the sunlight touched the cold stone, was enough to make the day seem a little less oppressive, to remind them that there was still beauty, even if it was distant and difficult to grasp. And then, there were the small, rare moments when a staff member, a nurse, or an attendant would offer a gesture of kindness. It was never grand, never extravagant. There were no hugs, no expressions of deep compassion. But every now and then, there would be a soft word, a fleeting glance of understanding, a smile that seemed to offer some acknowledgement of the patient's humanity, even if it was for just a second. These brief moments would often come when a nurse came into a patient's room to check on them, to ensure they were settled in for the night, or perhaps in the morning, when the staff would come around to offer their routine care. In these rare instances, a nurse might say something simple, like, "You're doing well," or "It's a quiet day today." These were not words of deep care or empathy, but they were words that signaled, if only for a moment, that the patient was not invisible. That, in a world where they were often reduced to mere cases, mere numbers in the ledger of the institution, they were seen, they were acknowledged, even if the acknowledgement was fleeting and impersonal. And sometimes, there would be a small touch, a hand placed on a shoulder, just for a moment, offering some comfort, some brief connection. These gestures were not often, not frequent enough to build any true sense of trust or safety, but for the patient who received them, they could offer a fleeting sense of warmth. In a world where human touch was often cold and clinical, these small moments, though rare, were like glimmers of hope that, perhaps, Not everyone had forgotten them. But perhaps the most comforting moment, though still rare, came in the form of a letter from home. These letters, though few and far between, offered a sense of connection to the world outside the asylum, a world that felt increasingly distant as time wore on. The letters often came in the morning, when the first light of dawn was still struggling to break through the fog of the asylum's darkened halls. The sight of a letter, folded and sealed, would bring a flicker of hope to even the most despondent patient. It was a lifeline to the world they had once known, a reminder that, beyond the walls and the iron bars, someone still remembered them, someone still cared. The letters were often brief, simple in their contents. A few lines, perhaps a paragraph, from a spouse, a parent, or a sibling. "We are thinking of you. Hope you're doing okay. Stay strong, we'll visit soon." The words were always hopeful, even when the reality of the situation was anything but. The patient would hold that letter in their hands, reading it over and over, as if the words themselves could offer some comfort, some sense of connection to the life they had left behind. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a solution to the endless waiting or the confinement. But in that moment, the letter would offer something, a brief escape from the crushing reality of the asylum. And even on the rare days when the staff would allow a short walk in the courtyard, there would be moments when the mind would momentarily be free. The courtyard, though barren and devoid of life, still offered a small glimpse of the outside world. The dry trees, the cracked earth, the faint sound of distant birds. All of these were reminders that the world was still turning, that life was still moving, even if it seemed as though it had stopped in the confines of the asylum. The patients who walked there, under the watchful eye of a nurse or attendant, would sometimes catch a glimpse of the sky, the fleeting clouds moving across the horizon, the distant sun struggling to break through the haze. And though the courtyard was devoid of any real beauty, the act of stepping outside, of feeling the fresh air on their faces, even if it was cold and damp, was enough to break the monotony, even if only for a few moments. The wind, though sharp and biting, would stir the dry leaves on the ground, creating a sound that almost felt like life. The wind in the trees, the distant call of a crow, the soft rustle of the bushes. These small, simple sounds would offer something that the asylum could never provide: the sensation of connection to the world beyond. The world outside, with all its freedom and life, seemed just out of reach, but in those brief moments, it felt as though the asylum were just a little smaller, just a little less confining. And then, after the briefest of walks, the patients would return to their rooms, to their tasks, and to the endless waiting. The moments of relief, however small, would slip away quickly, like sand through their fingers. But for those who experienced them, those fleeting instances of light, of warmth, of connection, they were enough to keep the spark of hope alive, if only for a moment. In a place like the asylum, where life was marked by routine, isolation, and pain, these small moments became the only source of comfort. They were the fragile threads that held the patients together, threads that connected them to a life beyond the walls, to something more than the endless days of monotony and suffering. Every day, there would be moments of grief, but enough to remind them that, somewhere out there, life continued. And for that small moment, in the midst of the darkness, there was a sense of peace, however fleeting, however fragile. As the story slowly comes to a close, and the day in the asylum fades from memory, it is time to pause to reflect. The long hours, the repetitive routines, the cold and the silence, the moments of fleeting comfort, they are all now just whispers in the mind, drifting away like the gentle sounds of the night. And so, we look back, one final time, on what life inside that 1800s asylum was like. The cold, dark hallways, the unrelenting silence, the harsh treatments, and the moments of quiet, fleeting relief. It was a world where the days were long, the nights were even longer, and the weight of confinement was felt with every breath. But as we reflect on this story, we also remember something important. This was a place where, despite the cold, despite the silence, there was always hope. Even if it was fragile, even if it was fleeting, the patients, though trapped in their rooms, though isolated from the world, still clung to those small, fleeting moments of light, those brief moments of connection, of warmth, of relief. And in this way, the asylum, for all its harshness, for all its coldness, could never completely strip away the humanity of those who lived inside it. Because even in the darkest corners, the heart still beats, still yearns, still seeks connection. Even when surrounded by walls, when locked away, when isolated from the outside world, the human spirit remains resilient. It finds small moments of light, small moments of peace, even in the harshest of circumstances. And as the story fades into memory, we remember those moments of light, just as the patients did. The rays of morning sun that barely touched the stone floors, the rare moments of kindness from a nurse, the comfort of a letter from a loved one, the quiet relief of a walk in the barren courtyard. These moments, though brief, gave meaning to the long days, the nights filled with silence and waiting. And now, as you lay back and let your body relax, you can feel the warmth of those moments, the light of those small, fragile sparks that flickered in the darkness. Let them fill you. Let them offer you comfort in the same way they comforted those patients. Let them be the stillness that carries you into the night. Take a deep breath in, slowly, gently, and as you exhale, feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into relaxation. Let the tension of the day melt away, as if it were simply fading into the distance, leaving only the quiet peace of the present moment. Breathe in, feel the cool, calm air filling your lungs, and breathe out, letting go of any remaining tension. With each breath, your body becomes heavier, your mind becomes quieter, and you drift deeper into a state of peace. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting by a warm fire, the crackling of the flames softly filling the space around you. The air is warm and comforting, and the light from the fire dances gently across the walls. You are safe, surrounded by warmth, and there is no rush, no urgency, just the peaceful quiet of the present moment. As you continue to breathe slowly and deeply, let the weight of your body sink deeper into relaxation. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the soft rhythm of your heartbeat, a reminder that you are alive, that you are safe, that you are at peace. Let your arms become heavy, your legs, your feet, as though the tension is simply slipping away, leaving your body light and relaxed. With each breath, feel yourself sinking deeper, deeper into a state of calm. Let your mind wander now to a place of peace, to a place where the world is slow, where time moves gently and without hurry. Picture yourself in a quiet room, the air still, the world outside distant. And within this room, there is only you, the soft sound of your breath, and the warmth of the fire. You are in a place of safety, a place where there is no judgment, no fear, only comfort. As you rest here, feel the gentle embrace of this quiet, peaceful space. You are not bound by time, not bound by the worries of the world. In this space, you are free. And as you sit by the fire, feeling the warmth surrounding you, notice how your body feels, how light it has become, how relaxed, and how at ease. You are free to simply exist, to let go of everything, to allow your mind to drift like the soft embers in the fire. Feel your muscles soften, your jaw loosen, your shoulders drop. With each breath, your body becomes lighter, your mind quieter, and the peacefulness within you grows stronger. There is no need to rush. There is nothing more to do, but relax and allow yourself to drift. Now picture the night outside calm and still, the sky dark with a few scattered stars above. The world outside is peaceful, the wind gently moving the leaves on the trees, a soft, reassuring sound that reminds you that the world is still moving, even when you are at rest. The air is cool, and you are wrapped in the warmth of the fire, feeling safe and comfortable. In this moment, there is nothing to worry about, nothing to fear. You are at peace. You are free. The quiet embrace of the night surrounds you, and the gentle sounds of the world outside lull you into a deeper state of calm. As you continue to breathe, deeply, gently, allow the world around you to fade away. Allow your thoughts to drift, like the soft winds that move the trees outside. Let them pass by without attachment, without concern. Breathe in peace, breathe out any tension, and let yourself drift deeper and deeper into the stillness, into the quiet, into the rest that your body and mind so deeply need. Nothing more to think about, nothing to do, but rest, but sleep. And as you surrender to the quiet, you feel your body and mind completely at ease, completely still. Now just relax, let go, and know that when the time comes for you to drift off completely, you will be held in peace, in warmth, in safety. Take one last deep breath in, and as you exhale, let go of everything. Let the silence and the stillness fill you, and allow yourself to slip into the comfort of sleep, knowing that the story, and all the quiet moments it held, will continue with you, gently, even in your dreams. Good night, and may your sleep be deep and peaceful.